Hello, everyone. We're glad you could join us for another edition of the COVID Conversations. I'm Pastor Clayton Sellers. I'm Associate Pastor at Faith Lutheran Church in Collierville, Tennessee. It's a suburb of Memphis. I'm here today with Pastor Ben Ahlersmeyer. And Pastor Ben and I were, we went to seminary together. We were classmates. We were on slightly different tracks, but we always found time to eat lunch together. With a group of guys that has affectionately stood the test of time, known as the lunch table. It was for me, it was a very edifying, very enjoyable, entertaining time. Very important part of my my seminary formation, my seminary career. And I was glad to share that with Ben. And so Ben is here today to share some of his thoughts and his reflections on the past year. The life of the church, and what this means for us moving forward. So, Pastor Ben, thanks for joining us. And if you would just tell us a little about yourself, your family, where you're serving right now, and we'll jump in.
Yeah, my name is Ben. Yeah, I'm a pastor here at Bethlehem Lutheran Church in Fort Wayne, Indiana. Married to my wife Melissa for 10 years, and have a son Seth, who will be turning 3 in the middle of March. He actually turned 2 right maybe a day or two before 15 days to slow the spread started.
Oh, wow.
So
wow,
it was an uncertain weekend.
Sure.
So yeah.
That's a strange thing. I was at maybe the store. I don't remember where I was, but I saw a mom holding a baby talking to a sibling of the baby, saying, Susie has only ever known life with Susie has only ever known people wearing masks. This baby doesn't know that people don't wear masks all the time, and that was a strange sort of a reflection. So as you've been serving as a pastor through this pandemic, what are some of those things that have come up in your mind about the pandemic and the life of the church, and how we can think about these things in the past, and how can we think about them moving forward?
Yeah, it's funny. Right before the lockdown happened, actually it was in January, our congregation where I was serving before, and we'll get into that, I'm sure. We had an epiphany party at my house, a house blessing, and I had spent January, February blessing houses because we were in the process of exploring what our neighborhood was, where God had placed us individually, and how we could be agents of welcome and peace and grace in our communities. And we were blessing our homes to be just that. And it's just so strange as I look back. We're going to have these memories now popping up. And I saw that memory of the house blessing. I just said, what did we bless our houses to be in this time? It just is crazy to me. But I think it did, in terms of the church in this pandemic, I think it's caused us to really honestly care about one another, each other. It forced us to think about each other outside of our building, because we only see each other once a week, a lot of us. And that was a big effort early on, is to look to, who are our shut-ins? Who are the people who can't get out at all? I was bringing food to people. We were getting stuff together. Our church had been doing community dinners, and I knew there were families that counted on that. So how do we, in the midst of a pandemic, continue to serve and care for people? Really wrestling through that kind of stuff. So it was forcing us to be the church outside of the church, which is, I think, what God wants us to do. And so I tried to look at it positively in that way, although there was a lot of isolation and separation too.
Sure.
So yeah.
You've mentioned 2 different things that are very intriguing to me. So I want to go back to this idea of house blessings. Say more about this, what this house blessing is, how you were using it, and just what all is behind this idea of a house blessing. It was something that we did when we moved into our house here in Collierville. And I've done a few as a pastor, but I don't know if this is an idea that a lot of people might have heard about. So tell us more about these house blessings, why you did it, and how you went about doing it. Sure.
So it's a tradition to do around Epiphany. It's to recognize you welcome in the wise men, kind of thing. And you read through the story of the Nativity,
Okay.
the Magnificat and things like that. And really, you go room to room in the house and bless each room for its purpose.
Okay.
And our church, as I said before, our church is having a conversation about being welcoming in our neighborhood, really having conversations about hospitality and how do we open our homes and let them be what they are, but then welcome people into them. A lot of times our houses are our fortress. And so that's what's just so funny when I think about what they ended up becoming in this pandemic, what we were trying to make them be, it's just like, but at the end of the blessing, you pray together and you chalk the doors with the year and the initials of the wise men, CMB.
Okay.
And that's like a sign that the house has been blessed, and it's a sign to people who are coming that they are welcome here.
Oh,
This
okay.
is a welcome, loving home.
Yeah.
And it's phrased that way. We kind of tweaked the process a little, or the liturgy of it, to get people thinking about that a little bit more. Yeah.
That's an interesting, that's a serendipitous event that's happened. One of the things I've been thinking about is how people generally in the culture deny that God continues to work in the world today. But a house blessing sort of implicitly admits and says, God will be working in this place. God is active amongst his people, even amongst their houses, in their homes. And these become in a very real sense, a sacred place that's different than the sanctuary, but is yet still a sacred place where the life of the church, the members of the congregation still live out their life of faith. And that's a really powerful witness.
Yeah.
And go ahead.
Oh, and that we are agents of God's grace, that he works through us, and that he welcomes in the stranger through us. I think that's a powerful part of it too. Yeah.
And you were talking about doing those house blessings so people would think about hospitality, Christian hospitality. And I guess part of that root of hospitality is hospital. That caring for, that therapeutic stuff that happens at hospitals. I know we think of hospitals as being a place where people get surgery and go under treatments and to be treated for diseases and sickness. But in a very real way, it sounds like you were doing some hospitality, some hospital work in your community dinners, delivering food and those sorts of things. So tell us more about how you we're serving your community in that way, in that hospital sense as a congregation.
Yeah. Well, we were thinking through how we can continue to do this, and unfortunately, we weren't really able to put together a plan to really continue those community dinners. I think there was so much unknown when everything locked down. I mean, people were wiping down their groceries when they brought them home, and so it was like, how can people feel comfortable receiving food from us? How are we comfortable being around each other? It was just, and we never figured it out. The school system had figured it out. They were still, because, a lot of families depend on the meals.
Right.
So the school system was able to hand out, they had long lines at the school in Portage, handing out those meals. And we thought, okay, the families are being cared for in that way. And so I felt a little bit better. But yeah, so we weren't able to really figure that out. We couldn't piece it together because of such the uncertainty of the situation.
Sure. And that uncertainty of how do we serve the community, I imagine also spilled over then into the life of the congregation, especially in the worship life. How did you, as a pastor, how were you thinking about the worship life of the congregation, especially in those first 2 to, I guess, about 4 or 5 months?
Yeah. Well, we had closed down.
Okay.
We had shut down worship. There were other churches in our circuit. We had just such a wide variety of expressions of what we should be doing within our circuit.
Okay.
The nice thing, I think, was that we all trusted each other to do what we felt was necessary, which is an important thing. I mean, you feel you're questioning every decision you're making, but when you have people, okay, I'm doing this, but I understand why you're doing this. Really stressful time.
Yeah.
But we had to scramble and figure out online doing our service online, I was streaming everything from my phone.
Really?
So
Okay.
I remember, I'll never forget our Easter processional.
Uh-huh.
I brought in Seth's wagon and we
Okay.
put my camera on a tripod, and I I put it in such a way where you couldn't see I was pulling the wagon, but it was a
Yeah.
processional in for Easter. And it was funny. I
Yeah.
don't know, but we had completely shut down. We didn't have anybody in or out of the building. I worked remotely, sort of the secretary. But we figured it out, just reaching people digitally, and those who we couldn't reach digitally, we got them CDs of the services or something
Okay.
like that. We wanted to maintain some kind of connection in that way. And yeah, so that's what we ended up doing. The funny story with that is the, the council at church decided this was a good time to get the roof finally fixed.
Oh, okay.
And there was no Wi-Fi in the sanctuary. So when they fixed the roof, they put some new kind of liner on it that just totally killed my cell reception.
Oh no.
So I could no longer stream from my phone because I was doing it all on data on my phone.
Oh, okay. Okay.
And so then we started pre-recording stuff and then kind of premiering it at the time.
Yeah.
Which was kind of weird because then I could actually watch myself do worship, which was a bizarre thing.
Sure.
And I realized at that moment, maybe this is an important thing to recognize too, how hard it is to worship at home. I mean, when I sat there with Melissa and Seth watching me on the TV screen.
Yeah.
I mean, it's his living room, he wants to play. So I wonder what worship life was like for people when they were just at home and how fulfilling that was. And that was something that always kind of bothered me about the online experience was, is it really doing what we want it to do,
Yeah.
and are people really getting everything out of it that they want?
Right. That's an interesting question. And I want to come back to that question about people's experience of online worship and your experience of online worship. But I want to take a step back and ask, what is it about Christian worship? What is it about Lutheran worship that, as far as I know, so many, I would say a majority of Lutheran churches scrambled to get technology in place to provide an online digital worship experience? And maybe we haven't thought about it all the way, but what do you think it is about our Lutheran understanding, our understanding of Christian worship, that led us to scramble so desperately to get something in place for so people could worship even in the face of those lockdowns?
Yeah, I think the one thing was the community aspect of it. It was nice, people are commenting on Facebook that they can say hello to each other and everything. I think there is something in that, that you at least know you're watching. You can see the little number in the corner, how many people are watching. So people are with you, even if they're not sitting with you. But the thing that we're missing, the key part, is just that, of course, receiving Christ's body and blood in the sacrament. I mean, it was so hard to essentially take a fast. We were fasting from that. And, to not have that at Easter was just it just felt like such an empty celebration. We didn't have the Easter lilies trumpeting the resurrection on the altar. It was just kind of a barren space, proclaiming the resurrection to empty pews. So I think, the community aspect of it, we weren't really getting, although you could kind of feel it online. But that receiving God's gifts, that is the thing that's supposed to kind of keep us going, that fills us up, and we kind of expend ourselves throughout the week to be filled up again. We just weren't getting that. And that was another thing that I know other guys did, like drive-through communion, where they were able to serve in that way. People figured out ways to do communion. We just decided, let's just fast for a season. And then when we're finally together, it'll be a joyous celebration.
Yeah. So you talked about, missing some things, and if you had, looking back, especially on those times of lockdown, when we were streaming only, when you were streaming only, was that worship beneficial? Was that true worship? Was it Was it delivering the goods, so to speak, for people who were watching it?
That's a tough question. I mean, I think it was,
Okay.
I think we made do with what we could.
Mhm.
And in some ways still are,
Yeah.
yeah, I think it's true worship. And it's funny. I mean, I think for a lot of us Lutheran churches, and probably for a lot of churches, I mean, it really took a global pandemic for us to finally change and adapt.
Mhm.
Because churches are doing this all the time. And
Yeah.
I always thought we were a pretty small congregation. I thought, we could never afford streaming. Why would we do
Mhm.
that?
Mhm.
And now here we are, we're broadcasting every Sunday. And
Yeah.
it's just a weird shift, a weird change, but
Yeah.
we're still proclaiming the gospel.
Mhm.
And I think, um, especially when I was thinking through sermons and things like that, it was the effects of sin are clearly around us and we're
Mhm.
feeling it. And although I'm not an anxious person, I think I could truly understand what anxiety was in that time,
Mm.
because it's literally a presence in your life you have no control over, and it
Yeah.
dictates like a lot of your life.
Right.
And so how do you preach into that? And I think that part of worship was that reminder that, you know, he's got the whole world in his hands is a true statement. And we
Yeah.
can be reminded of those things.
Yeah.
And that encouraging, hopeful word, even if it's just over a screen, I think that was an important thing to keep going with.
Mhm. So would it be fair to say that it was the streaming option, especially during those lockdowns, um, was maybe it was worship, but it maybe wasn't the ideal way to handle it or the ideal situation?
Well, no, I think it was. I think it served its purpose for a season, and
Mhm.
I don't think it's ever going away at this point,
Okay.
which is fine. But I think now that we're coming out of it, especially now, the conversations we're having at church are, how do we remind people that being here is a good thing?
Mm.
How do we remind people that being here is a really encouraging, uplifting thing?
Mhm.
Some people maybe they're just liking sitting at home
Mm.
watching, and that,
Mhm.
it's not a judgment call. It's just you are missing out on a really key part of the
Sure.
Christian faith, the Christian life, and receiving what God gives to us.
Yeah. Now,
Um,
those conversations about the the fullness that comes of being in worship, is it just you leading those conversations, or are leaders in the congregation and other members of the congregation also having those conversations with you and bringing it up to you?
I think right now they're just, and they had been brought up by me.
Okay.
I think it's hard because everybody handles this pandemic differently. I think everybody's afraid to say, and maybe not afraid is the right word, but how do we when do we get back to normal? Is it okay to
Mm.
even push to talk about that?
Oh, uh-huh.
And everybody kind of falls on the spectrum with that, and you got to kind of respect where everybody's at.
Yeah.
And I think it's been an okay thing, but I don't know if I haven't had anybody really push that envelope and
Okay.
say, we need to get people back, or we need to remind people why it's good to be here.
Mhm.
But I think that's part of the pastor's role, is to lead and push into uncertain spaces and say it's
Right.
okay, because again, God is still in control.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, how has this past year, how has this shaped your preaching and teaching? You talked about that some of that anxiety, and you're not an anxious person, but you can understand there's this presence, and hearing God's word in the midst of that and delivering God's word. I'm curious to know if you've reflected on, or if you've noticed any change in the way that you preach, or the way that you teach, or the way that you go about writing or composing sermons. I'm just curious about how this past year has shaped your preaching and teaching.
Yeah, and actually, it's again, I don't know if serendipitous is the right word, but the Lenten series we were into when everything
Mhm.
shut down, we were talking about sin and death as kind of a veil over all creation.
Oh,
I
uh-huh.
had worked on it with another pastor friend who I think you've talked to
Okay.
on this, but just kind of, I think it's in Isaiah where the veil's cast off.
Yeah. Is it
Um,
Isaiah 27 maybe?
um, I have 25, maybe. I think I
Yeah.
use it a lot in funeral sermons anyway, where that covering that is over all people is cast off on his holy mountain. And just thinking about how death is kind of this thing that just is on everything. It just kind of, you can see the cross, but it's kind of, shades your vision a little bit.
Yeah.
It ended up being that was what the pandemic was. And so preaching that ended up being a very practical series talking about how sin it taints everything. And I found myself preaching a lot more of us as victims of sin, probably than perpetrators, because that was the law that was weighing heavy. That was, we're all at home. I mean, we're probably, bickering at home, and there's definitely a lot of stuff that goes with that, even statistically speaking. But I mean, the effects of sin are very obvious in our world, and it's how do we break free from this? And that was a that informed a lot of preaching, still does, and I think it's helped me proclaim a more explicit gospel.
Oh, okay.
That really is cast off. I mean,
Sure.
Literally picture a pandemic being just pulled off this earth whenever he decides to do that. Just as he pulls back sin and death, so we can see his glory face to face. I think it's a more explicit, more tangible gospel than, and I don't want to sound bad when I say this, but sometimes pastors just sneak in, by the way, Jesus died for your sins.
Sure.
You are forgiven. And it's like, maybe they're saying some great things. Oh yeah, I have to get that in there somewhere. But it's no, this is a tangible reality that people really need. They really need it right now.
Yeah. Sometimes pastors default into the gospel like, and Jesus died for your sins.
Yeah, right.
I noticed
and it's
that.
True.
It's true, but how you lost some creativity there, guy. I noticed that during Lent and the lockdowns when we were streaming only, that it was because everybody was going through the same pandemic. Everybody was focused and experienced. It made it much easier for me to do that law and that gospel. I didn't have to kind of hit multiple different groups because there was just one group. Those affected by the pandemic, those whose worship life was disrupted, those who were suffering from this pandemic, and everybody was there. And so it seemed like my sermons were more pointed, and as they were more pointed, they were more poignant and beneficial for the members of my congregation and for those who were listening, however they were joining streaming.
Yeah, for sure, absolutely. Yeah.
Did you do anything teaching wise, like Sunday school wise, or I don't know, like a series of Facebook Live videos or posts talking about, I don't know, like that hidden will of God? And I'm not trying to set you up. I'm just curious. Did you do anything to address suffering in the world or huge events like this that kind of put us in that place of victim or wondering, why is this happening to me? God, what's the purpose of all of this? Did you do anything to talk about that sort of thinking outside of your sermon series?
No, I always have a hard time with that conversation in general.
Okay.
It's because we try to explain away a lot of things. And I know it's a question everybody wrestles with, but I don't know. I didn't really do a lot of time dwelling on that. So I think there probably are people who think this is some kind of punishment from God. There are people who think, what have we done wrong? If we do this thing, will it finally be lifted or whatever?
Yeah.
And I just, you end up trying to explain God's behavior. And sometimes I just prefer his behavior or his plan to be a little mysterious. And I'm okay with that. I know a lot of people aren't, but no, but in terms of connection though, with just videos in general, I found myself a lot if I was wrestling through a thought for the day or, news popped on or something else was drawing our attention. I'd hop on and just do a live video and just kind of share my thoughts, free flowing. And it seemed to be a genuine connection with people in the congregation. They seemed to enjoy that. I remember the first devotion, probably one of the first devotions I did. I was just thinking on that verse. It's a verse everybody knows, but it's be still and know that I am God.
Mm-hmm.
And, it's like, well, yeah, we know that you're God, but maybe the whole point of the lockdown, or at least this season right now, is for us to be still,
Yeah.
and that, just thinking about that part where life is so hectic, so
Mhm.
crazy. And yeah, you could think of it as I'm locked down, I'm confined in my home, I'm restricted. But I got to spend a lot of time with my family.
Sure.
I got to, there were some good things, and I know it
Mhm.
wasn't good for everybody. I know,
Yeah.
there was a lot of cost to that, and
Yeah.
we saw a lot of the cost of it at our church. But focusing on that, yeah, we know that you are God, but maybe we need to be still in that for a moment.
Mhm.
So
Can you talk more about just how this has impacted you and your wife and your son, and positive or negative? This is not just in general how you have handled this within your nuclear family in your home.
Well, we just learned to take it one day at a time,
Mm-hmm.
and yeah, I don't know. We grew to appreciate the time together. We spent a lot of time walking because that was the only thing we could do. We just go out and walk.
Yeah.
We built a lot of different variations of Seth's train track, his train tracks, every variation you could think of. Filled the
Yeah.
living room. So no, it was just a good time. Like I said, Seth had just turned 2,
Right.
and so. Yeah, we spent some time trying to potty train. I was telling you that earlier.
Oh,
but,
yeah.
Still working on it a year later. So, you try to take advantage of the time. And of course, you see everybody's, doing different things during this time. But no, I think we spent a lot of time reflecting on
Mm-hmm.
what God is doing. We tried to spend a lot of time in prayer and devotion. It forces you to do that.
Yeah.
And, it's like, well, let's not make this wasted time.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. One of the things that as I've been thinking about this for myself, I remember in those first few weeks being very, I guess, angry or frustrated, and I'm not on social media. I don't have Twitter. I don't have Instagram. I really don't have a Facebook account, so I'm not on social media. But there was enough stuff on social media going around of, oh, I'm laying around watching Netflix, and oh, I'm just going to drink wine all day, and blah, 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 blah.
Watching Tiger King, or something like
watching
that.
Tiger King. And I remember being upset and frustrated that that's not how my pandemic started. My pandemic started with a ton more work and a ton more effort for serving the congregation, for being a husband, for being a father. There was a lot more effort was required, and my whole patterns were upset, and that upset me. I'm curious if you had a similar reaction, or what you think about that.
Well, yeah, I mean, gosh, those first month or so was so stressful. Probably the most stressed I've ever been in my life, because you've got everybody's perspective on what you should be doing. We shouldn't shut down. We should shut down.
Yeah.
We finally, we had opened up at the end of May, and what does that look like? I had to figure out, and it's okay. I mean, I'm not complaining, but
Right.
Figured out IT. I mean, I was the IT guy. I wrote grants to get technology. There was just so much stuff to figure out, and I didn't have a lot of help. And that's just the nature of it. But yeah, and I think the other thing that really weighed on me and continues to, and we talk about probably switching congregations, but I was in Portage, a pretty blue collar town. We had there's a lot of cost to being at home. And so when people took it lightly, like, oh, I get to finally do that puzzle I always wanted to do, or whatever. No, I had people who were deemed non-essential, in our congregation, who lost their jobs. I dealt with just about every COVID scenario you could think of. I mean, some images that'll just stay in my mind forever. I had a widow kissing her husband through a mask, as he, at the funeral.
Yeah.
I had people who watched their parents die through glass. I had I had a suicide in my congregation because of, so,
Now, real quick, what do you say in those times? What were you saying to that widow? What were you saying to those who are watching their parents? What were you saying to those families during all of that time?
mainly, I mean, I probably said different ways, but mainly
Yeah.
God sees this. God sees this, he hears this, and he'll make it right.
Mm.
And, that's all you can really say.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's just, there's so much over you that is controlling your life that, I just had people so mad that they couldn't visit their loved ones in the hospital. I had people so scared that if I go to the hospital, I'll never see anybody else again and I'll die alone.
Mm.
So of course, there's always the conversation of the lockdown or open or whatever it is.
Mhm.
I saw a lot of the cost of being home.
Mm.
And, I had a police officer in our congregation. He told me, the calls for domestic violence were way up.
Yeah.
And a lot of those things, it's just those uncounted costs.
Mm-hmm.
And that really weighed on me as a pastor.
Mm-hmm.
That really weighed on me as a pastor.
Yeah. You were talking, what you told me you were telling to those families reminds me of the opening chapters of Exodus, where God saw his people, he heard their cry, and then it says, and God knew. And he sees the affliction, he hears our cries, and he knows that the solution is his son, Jesus Christ, that's going to lift the veil, as you talked about, that's going to cure us of all of our diseases, restore creation back to how he attended it. So it sounds like you had a very real opportunity to apply that balm of the gospel in very tangible ways. Is that a fair thing to say?
Yeah.
Hmm.
And, I think that's the stuff, although it sounds kind of strange, you understand what I mean. That's the stuff we get into this for, to be able to preach the gospel, be privileged in those moments to speak the gospel. In those private moments.
Mm-hmm.
And God equips us to do that. We do it as best as we can, but
Sure.
Yeah.
To again, kind of going back to that home blessing, there's an implicit and faithful understanding that God is active in the world through his word, through his called ministers to apply that gospel. Yeah. Well, I appreciate your faithful service to those families, Ben.
Thanks.
I imagine that there's more than you'll ever hear about how that has impacted them.
Yeah.
I'm gonna switch subjects on you.
Sure.
From helping those families. You mentioned that you switched congregations in this pandemic. You were at one call, and you've now taken another call to be at Bethlehem.
Mm-hmm.
What was it like coming into a congregation? I mean, coming into a congregation has its own, I don't want to call them obstacles, but its own challenges and things to be aware of in normal times. What's it been like coming into a congregation in the midst of a pandemic?
Yeah, I think part of it is I haven't been a part of any of the procedures, how things run. And things run differently here, just differently than we did at St. Peter.
Right.
And so kind of, I'm not in a position of, I don't know how to phrase it, but I'm stepping into a system, I guess, that's already been running.
So like an example that I think of is,
and Bethlehem, actually, they had.
One of the things I'm thinking about is, like, you don't know how to set up the tables for a potluck.
Right.
I mean, it's down, like, it's not just the worship stuff or the it's that very nitty gritty life of the congregation stuff that is neither good nor bad, but there's a way to set up, like, a correct way to set up potluck tables at Faith Lutheran. And it's different than the correct way to set up tables for the potluck at Bethlehem, but they're both correct.
Yeah,
And is it those sorts of, I know that's a trivial example. It's an important example because it's that life together. But are those the sorts of procedure things that you're thinking of that you haven't been a part of?
well, in some ways it feels like a clean slate. We can kind of
Mhm.
do what we want to do because with COVID, it's everything's kind of out the window,
Mhm.
and that's been I guess just an overall refreshing thing in this is that it's allowed us to say, all right, let's rethink everything. But
Mhm.
I think the hardest thing about coming into a congregation is you're seeing everybody from here up, you
Oh,
know, um, and you can't go see people,
yeah.
and how do you get to know people? You get to know the people who are hanging around, who are doing
Mhm.
things in the church, and but the average person, how do you get to know them? How do you get to meet them?
Sure.
How do you even know what they look like?
Right.
It's like
Right.
it's just hard. It's difficult, and I think, well, I know here, and probably in any congregation, there's extra grace for a transition like this,
Mhm. Mhm.
um, and people are just excited to have a pastor at this time. They had closed down completely, and they weren't even doing online
Oh,
services.
wow. Okay.
Um, but now we have they were able to set up an online service before I got here and everything, so
Okay.
it wasn't like having to do it twice.
Right. Right.
um, so I'm thankful for that. But they have been wonderful in terms of bringing me in, but it is difficult when being a pastor, and especially when you come from situations so heavy, like I did at
Mhm.
my last congregation, where you're intimately involved in people's lives.
Yeah.
Now it feels a little distant, and it's not because anybody wants it to be that way, but
Mhm.
that's just kind of the nature of the situation right
Right.
now.
Have you, um, I've got two thoughts here, and I'll do one at a time. Have you
Okay.
experimented with any ways of trying to get to know people? You talked about getting to know people from here up or visiting. Have you tried to think or experiment with any ways of getting to know or converse or touch base with those who might not be in Sunday worship or hanging around the office as you mentioned?
Well, one thing is just being present before and after the service.
Mm, mhm,
I would spend a lot of time more just prepping, make sure I'm ready to go for the
mhm,
service. Now I've got my mask on so that people are comfortable that I'm near them. And that
mhm.
was one thing, I didn't really wear a mask at St. Peter.
Okay.
Um, and I kept my distance, from people, but um, I didn't feel like we had a different kind of situation. And
Right.
here I wear it so that people are comfortable approaching me and I
Mm,
approaching them.
mhm,
And
mhm.
so um, just being more intentional of just those in between times, conversing with people.
Yeah.
Um, but in terms of any kind of like program or anything like that, no, I haven't really come with anything like that.
Okay.
I my first Sunday was the first Sunday in Advent here,
Oh,
and
okay.
so I hit the ground running,
Yeah.
and so yeah, it's just been kind of a crazy whirlwind in that way,
Sure.
in that sense too.
Now, you talked about COVID providing maybe an opportunity for a clean slate. It was something you talked about. How are you and the leadership at Bethlehem there um, evaluating the different programs and the different things that have for so long been staples and mainstays of the church calendar, the potlucks, the VBS, the men's breakfast, the women's luncheon, whatever it might be. All of all of that got stopped, and you've talked about it being a clean slate. How are y'all going about having that conversation about what do we bring back? When do we bring it back? Why do we bring it back? What does that look like?
Yeah, I think in a lot of ways people have just accepted that these events aren't happening. And so
Mhm.
I don't really have, although I did just today have somebody ask me, are we doing the Easter egg hunt this
Mm.
year? And I said, oh, I didn't even know we did that. So,
Uh-huh.
sure, whatever. I'm pretty open, to doing whatever.
Yeah.
But there's been so much canceled. And I
Mhm.
think that is the um, default mode, I guess you could
Mhm.
say, is that no, it's just not going to happen. And so then, we just started. We had elders last night. What's the conversation going to be going forward with starting to open up worship? We have an older congregation. Most are getting vaccinated at this point.
Mhm.
We're seeing people starting to come back. So maybe that kind of signal in worship saying, "Hey, we're opening up. It's time to come home. It's time to come back." Um, maybe that'll encourage people a little bit to think about their individual activities,
Mhm.
what we have going on. But again, I don't even know what activities typically
Okay.
go on here.
Yeah.
I think they do a rummage sale in the summer. I've been hearing
Okay.
about that. But uh, yeah, so if the default mode is it's canceled, then I don't even know if it's supposed to be happening. So
Right. Right.
um,
And
yeah,
this is just to highlight the long ranging and deep impact of how quickly COVID kind of descended on us, and its long running nature as a pandemic, and as a response amongst the a response amongst our country, right, in all the different states
mhm.
and congregations. um I want to again change gears a little bit. What do you think this past year will mean for your congregation, for the Lutheran Church, for the church at large, moving forward? We've spent some time talking about how we've responded, how we've thought about things, but if you had to kind of predict or speculate into the future, what do you think this means? How do you think that this is going to impact the church moving forward, positive and or negative, just some of those long-ranging impacts that might come from this?
I think it made the faithful more faithful.
Mm,
We've had reflections in Bible study of just, gosh, I didn't know I'd want to be here so
mhm,
badly.
mhm.
And I don't know if people really said that before
Right.
COVID. Seeing people ache for the sacrament and then
Mhm.
to receive it for the first time was just, to kind of break that fast was an
Yeah.
amazing thing.
Yeah.
And that's just, one of those memories that's just going to stick with me of us celebrating that. Yeah, not everybody was there, but being able to do that again.
Mhm.
And the flip side of that is I think people who were tangentially connected have kind of fallen off.
Mm,
And so, um, how do we get those people back? How do we
mhm.
remind them that we still care about them?
Yeah.
How do we make them feel like this is a serious thing, this, that you
Yeah.
need this in your life,
Yeah. That's probably an important point that maybe you can say more about this, is that those that were tangentially connected or loosely connected, they're still important to your congregation, and they're still important
Yeah,
to God. That's the
absolutely.
So how do you think we go about, how do we as the church, you as a pastor in Bethlehem, how do you think we go about letting them know, hey, you're you're important to us as a congregation, as to people, as to the people of God. You're important to God. How do you think we might go about letting them know that again?
Yeah, it's probably like the same question you ask when you've got members on your rolls who haven't been
Mhm,
there in a really long
mhm,
time. You just say, how do we reach them?
mhm.
Well, do we send them a letter? Do we give them a call? Does a call from the pastor, is that too strange, or does it scare people off, or
Yeah.
an elder? We're just beginning those conversations here.
Mhm.
Um, just like when at my last congregation, when I first got there, I was handed a list of people. These are the people who haven't been around. So, reach out to them and
Yeah.
make it happen. And um, so I guess that would be just reaching out and letting them know. I mean,
Mhm.
the good thing for me, I have two good things going for me, which is I'm new here. So I'm
Okay.
kind of introducing myself.
Yeah.
And two, we're opening worship back up or whatever it is.
Mhm.
Now that the vaccines are out there, now that the state is opening up or whatever it is,
Mhm.
this is what we have going on. And maybe that's just a little entry point,
Yeah.
and it's kind of like, when we're reminded constantly throughout this, God hasn't forgotten about us. Well, our
Mm.
church hasn't forgotten about you either.
Mhm.
And so, those are just some things bouncing around my head. We've talked about a little bit,
Yeah.
and just that encouragement to come back.
Mhm.
Um, and we'll see how that goes, I guess.
Sure. Sure. One of the things I've been, I guess, wrestling with, thinking about, reflecting on, uh, is that at times I want to call the past year a wasted year, but then I back off from calling it a wasted year. I'm curious what you think about that. I don't want to call it a wasted year. Um, on my worst days, I call it a wasted year, but I often will back away from that. I'm curious what you think about that statement and that categorization of the past year.
Yeah, and gosh, that has implications for all areas of life. You think
Mhm.
about kids in school and everything too. How far have we fallen behind?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I guess the pastoral answer is, well, God was still doing things in the midst of it anyway, right? I mean, that's
Yeah.
the easy answer. But the question we have to ask ourselves, and I was starting to ask in my previous congregation, then all of a sudden I got to call it and move.
Yeah.
There's a question I ask here is, we got to stop thinking this is a holding pattern,
Mm.
and we have to stop thinking that this is, we're just going to wait it out, and then we'll
Mhm.
kind of just pick right up where we left off. It's
Yeah.
like, well, no, it's not the way it is. How do we adapt and how do we change? What have we learned about ourselves? And, for me, again, I think the things I've learned as a pastor, making sure people are cared for, making sure members are connected to each other. I found that at our last congregation, especially, that when members were calling members, reminding them, hey, we're all in this together, that meant a lot. That we can be the church without the church building,
No.
that we can do those things. And it just made me rethink, just why do I do office hours? Like, what is the purpose of me? I can write a sermon, out there somewhere, or I can be out on the street with people. Do we shut ourselves up in our buildings too much? So I don't know. It's caused me to think about a lot of things now. But then I guess maybe the fear, maybe the excuse is that COVID's still going on, and so we can't really test these theories. We can't really push out there a little bit because stuff is still going on.
Yeah.
I think there's an answer to your question somewhere in there.
No, I appreciate it. I appreciate it. That so where I've come down and where I think you're where what I'm hearing you say is wasted is probably too strong. It's not a wasted year. It's a different year. And if we go through it without any reflection, without any consideration about what we were doing before, what we've been doing during the pandemic, and what life as a congregation and as a church body and as the church moving forward, if we don't think about those things, then perhaps it was probably a wasted year. But if we're engaging in those topics, those questions like, why do I come and sit in my office and be at the church building at certain times? When do I go out into the community? If we're not asking those questions and then answering those questions in a thoughtful and considerate way, then it might be maybe a wasted opportunity, because God has continued to work through this.
Well, and I think too, it's funny, we have all these little arguments in church about events, or, the classic color of the church carpet, or whatever it is. All those questions just went away in a year. And you realize just how silly some of those things are and what really is important. And for me, I guess I continue to harp on, it's that personal connection. We have to be connected to one another, and we have to feel like God is present outside of this building.
Yeah.
And
because he is, right? And we're connected through Christ, right?
Yeah. But it's I mean, every event we have, do we need to have it? What is the purpose of it? Let's think through what we're doing. And gosh, God forbid another thing happen like this. We're going to have to continue to be the church. And what does that mean?
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, you get a glimpse of, well, I shouldn't even say this because it sounds dramatic, but you get a glimpse of what the church underground is like, where you can't gather together. You're not supposed to be with one another, and how do we continue to get the gospel out there?
Yeah.
If I could never be around the building again, would I feel as strengthened in my faith? Where does my hope and faith and trust reside? All those different things.
Yeah, it makes me think of the way that St. Paul uses the word ecclesia, right? So the word ecclesia existed before Paul, but it was for like a crowd gathered for a sporting event, that would then disperse and have no connection. But Paul then takes that ecclesia and says it's the people gathered in worship who, even though they go apart, are still connected through Jesus Christ. And that has implications for the Christian life. It has implications for how we live and how we're connected to God. And we share that hospitality that you talked about at the start.
Yeah, and I think too, when you think of your role as a pastor, sometimes I've fallen into this mode where I am just uh, uh, a wealth of information, although there are people much smarter than me. But and I am here to dump that information onto you. And maybe that's when I've done my job. And you realize, I mean, I was just looking at Paul writing, I think it was in 1 Corinthians yesterday, and he talks about how there's 1,000 guides in your life, but I'm to you like a father.
Yeah.
And you see that it's more than just, I'm here on Sunday to kind of set you back right here, but you're actually pouring yourself into your people, and it became much more real during the pandemic.
Yeah.
That it is much more than just a guide and a teacher on a Sunday, but that I care about your life in between Sundays, and I'm checking on your well-being, and it's more than just people who are shut in, although we were all shut in. But it's that shepherding, fathering role taken more serious.
I had that image of shepherding the sheep. As pastors, is you can do the history of the word, the etymology is bugs, etymology is words. You could do the etymology of it and get back to shepherd. We're the under shepherds. It's that image of Christ restoring Peter on the beach, right? Peter, do you love me? Feed my sheep. And that's what you're expressing, right? Is that no, I'm not just the Bible answer man.
Yeah.
I'm the under shepherd to this flock at Bethlehem Lutheran Church, at Faith Lutheran Church. And I care about you, and I want to see and I want to serve you as God's minister in whatever the situation. That's what I'm hearing you say.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, you think about when the pandemic hit, we're literally protecting people from, we're shielding them from this as we gather or whatever. We're trying to protect them in that way. But then you also realize protection and care is that checking up on every day, or being intimately involved in your everyday life. And it takes a lot out of you as a pastor, but it's also, you realize, gosh, this is what I'm called to do. This is what I'm supposed to be doing. And it becomes a much more rewarding relationship, I think, between pastor and people.
So the pandemic has stripped away the activity of the congregation, and it's stripped away a lot of other activities that pastors often find themselves in, and really focused in on worship and shepherding. Is that a fair way to kind of summarize this?
Yeah, I guess you could say so. Yeah.
Okay. Well, Ben, I really appreciate all your time and sharing and reflecting on this past year. I want to give you an opportunity to have the last word. Anything you've been thinking about, anything that has really stood out to you from the past year, whether it's a story of an interaction with a member, or a member of the congregation or of the community, a Bible verse that stood out to you, some sort of reflection or experience to close us out.
I just think I heard the other day that the word loneliness has really characterized this last year for a lot of people. And again, I was talking earlier about that mental health aspect of things. And an obvious, a well-known verse, I come up with well-known verses, nothing too deep, but when the Great Commission, Jesus encourages us, tells us to go teach, baptize, make disciples, all those things. We can't do those things alone.
Right.
And then he reminds us, I am with you always.
Yeah.
It's the very end of the age, and in a time like this, that becomes so much more real. Especially as a pastor, when you feel so alone in your decision making and you're questioning everything, and you're like, but I still need to teach, I need to confess, I need to baptize, I need to make disciples. Those things don't go away.
Right.
And that reminder that on a road that feels lonely, or if you're home feeling lonely, or whatever it is, and maybe it's a simple truth, but maybe we just need to be reminded of it.
Yeah.
Christ says, I'm going to be with you as you go. I'm going to be with you always.
Yeah.
And even in a pandemic when we're lonely.
Mm-hmm.
And so, that's a famous verse, I guess, that just sticks with me, though. And there's a charge there, there's a challenge, but then there's that invitation and comfort that comes when Christ says, you're not doing any of this alone. And by the way, coming from a guy who knows true loneliness, on the cross,
right?
That's never going to be you. And when we've come pretty close in this last year, I think that's a comforting reminder.
That's a really stark sort of image, right? That Christ cries out on the cross, lama lama, or Eloi Eloi lama sabachthani, my God, why have you forsaken me?
Yeah.
And then he's going to say, lo, I am with you always, even to the end of the age. I mean, to know that the depth of abandonment, but then the comfort of a promise to always be there. Ben, I appreciate you giving us that reflection on Christ being with us, even to the end of the age, even in the midst of a pandemic.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Ben, I want to thank you for your time again. I want to thank you for your honest reflections and engaging with all of these things and these topics. I pray God's richest blessings on you and Melissa and Seth, on your congregation there at Bethlehem as you grow into that pastorate, and hopefully get to see the low people's noses very soon. And as you wrestle together as God's people in that place, what does it mean to have that hospitality, to be a place where God's word is made known? I'm really excited to, as we continue our friendship, to hear how God's working in that place. As for all you who are watching, thank you for joining us. I hope this has been edifying, and I look forward to any comments that you might want to share or reflections that you have as well over this past year. Thank you, and God's blessings.